The National Famine Museum at Strokestown Park and Irish Heritage Trust are screening this film as part of the Great Famine Voices Roadshow 2020 online event series. The Great Famine Voices Roadshow is funded by the Government of Ireland Emigrant Support Programme.
My name's Greg Quiery and I am Chair of the Liverpool Great Hunger Commemoration Committee and author of In Hardship and Hope, A History of the Liverpool Irish. The interviews that we are presenting here will give you a unique insight into the experience of the Liverpool Irish. They are informative, I found them revelatory, at times funny and at times heartrending. We utilise the existing networks of the Great Hunger Commemoration Committee, the Liverpool Irish Festival, the Institute of Irish Studies in Liverpool, Irish Community Care Merseyside and the Liverpool Irish Centre to get in contact with people whose roots in Liverpool go back to the 1840s. And I was really delighted to see that we had no difficulty in finding those families. Many people in Liverpool have kept those records and are proud of them. So we had a great response to our requests. Liverpool, of course, was for many decades the hub of the Irish diaspora. People came here from Ireland and dispersed from here to all parts of the world, particularly the USA and Canada, and to other parts of Britain. But many also stayed here, a large number of them to die of starvation and disease in the months and years after their arrival. But a large number remained to join an existing Irish community and form the core of the Liverpool Irish. The accounts will confirm the unique character of the city and the challenges which the Irish community faced here in a British city. Many saw themselves as being almost on enemy territory coming here to Britain. There was widespread discrimination and lack of educational opportunity for skilled work and entry into the professions. So the Liverpool Irish remained for generations in the most deprived areas of the city. You'll find in these accounts that most of the men were working on the docks or going to sea, because Liverpool was one of the largest ports in the world in the 19th century. They were often working as stokers at sea, which is the most difficult and challenging job down in the boiler shoveling coal. You will find there are a number of themes in these accounts. The Irish way of life in Liverpool was manifest particularly in local parishes, Catholic parishes, with their own clubs and social events. You will also find that in Liverpool, often in contrast to other cities, Liverpool was a multicultural centre in the 19th century, when most other cities in Britain did not have migration on any scale. Here you had people, particularly seamen, who had come from Africa, the Caribbean, and all parts of the British Empire. There was a strong Italian community, a very strong Chinese community. And in Liverpool, where people were living cheek by jowl with each other, there was a lot of cross-cultural fertilisation, I think is the word that I would use. And you find in Liverpool that there are a substantial number of people with dual identities, with dual cultural background. People of West African and Irish origins, people with Caribbean and Irish heritage, people with Chinese and Irish heritage, or Italian and Irish. And we tried to reflect some of that in these interviews. Another thing you'll find in the interviews is evidence of Liverpool's very strong musical culture and the connection the Irish community had to that. Indeed, one of our interviewees was a cousin of George Harrison, the guitarist with the Beatles. Another thing which has come out in the interviews is that a lot of families had connections to the Irish War of Independence in the 1920s, when Liverpool was a place which, under Michael Collins's direction, sent arms and explosives over to Ireland in the regular shipping, which was going from Liverpool across to ports like Drogheda and Dublin and so on. So I hope you will find the interviews of interest. The Irish in Liverpool came into this multicultural environment and alongside other communities gave birth to the unique cultural heritage of this city. I hope we'll give you an insight into the character of the city, which is not exclusively Irish, but it is a culture which has been very heavily influenced by the Irish who came here, giving birth to a very vibrant culture and a culture which is very proud of its background and its identity and what it has achieved. And I must conclude by saying a big thank you to all those people who've come forward. We've not been able to include all of them in the archive, but thanks to them all for coming forward and sharing with us their histories of their involvement in Irish migration.
My name is Michael Boyle. I am a former university lecturer at the University of Liverpool. My family history is, we often say that we have our own diaspora running, because on both sides of my family I have Irish roots and also I have black roots. You can probably tell by looking at me. If I can talk about my mother's mother first, my great-grandparents on that side of the family. My great-grandmother came from Dublin, was born and reared in Dublin. My great-grandfather was from Africa, West Africa, Freetown, Sierra Leone. He came to this country, was educated in Edinburgh, passed out as a ship's captain, but he was never allowed to sail a ship out of Liverpool because the crews at that time in the 1800s wouldn't take orders from a black captain. So he always sailed as first mate. His name was James Barnclough Boyce. His grandfather was a slave on the island of Barbados. If ever you go to Barbados, you'll see Boyce's garage, Boyce's hire cars, and somewhere along the line, they must be related to me. On my father's side of the family, my grandmother was white, and my grandfather was from the West Indies. My grandmother, her family came from County Mayo, and they came into this city around about mid-1840s. Their name was MacHale, and we have a bar in Liverpool called MacHale's. On 51st Street in New York, there's a MacHale's. So there's all of these kind of connections in terms of my Irish roots. And again, I'm very, very proud of that. I'm very proud of the fact that I have this mixed heritage, and it's something people don't talk about a great deal. But if you look at Liverpool, and you particularly look at the Pitt Street and Park Lane district of the city, which is the southern end of the city, you see this melting pot, or salad bowl effect, as the urban geographers would describe it, of people of all different races rubbing shoulder to shoulder with each other, because this originally was the area of the emigrants' houses, where people would be going from Europe off to America, Australia and Canada on the White Star liners and the Cunard liners. Irish people who came to the city and settled here, not just up in the north end of the city, but a high concentration also settled in the southern end of the city to escape the famine, and kept coming after that. And if you look at the census material, you see all the Irish names alongside of Spanish names, Portuguese names, Armenian names, Russian names, because they were the emigrant houses, as they called them. The people would be in a holding condition in the houses until they boarded the ships to take them off for a new life. As well as that, you had seamen coming here to Liverpool. And again, as my two grandparents realised, if you like, my great-grandfather coming from West Africa and marrying an Irish woman and settling here in Henry Street, just off Duke Street again, just near Pitt Street at the southern end of the city. On the other side of the family, my grandma, Margaret Ann Dearden, was born and reared there, but her mother came over from Ireland, married a West Indian man, my grandfather Boyle, Arnold Boyle, settled in Liverpool and eventually moved to New York. So, and had I've got aunts and uncles born in America as well as born here. So it's that urban tapestry, rich urban tapestry and ethnic tapestry that really sums up my family history.
Right, my name's Teresa Hill. I come from a family of 5. My mother is white, born in England, but of Irish descent. And my father is West African, from Sierra Leone, from Timini tribe. I first started looking back into my ancestry about 5 years ago, and I was really pleased to discover our first Luke Bernard, who came from Ireland, Dublin, in 1840. He arrived at Liverpool. He stayed in Liverpool for a couple of months, and then he travelled to the Isle of Man, where he met a girl called Charlotte Louise Clucas. The Clucases were a big family on the Isle of Man. Charlotte's dad, Lys Clucas, was the first turnkey of the Isle of Man. So he met and married Charlotte, and they came back to Liverpool. He became a dockers labourer, and they had 5 children. One of those children was named John. John Bernard then became a dockers labourer when he left school, worked on the docks all his life. He married a lady called Bridget McMahon. They had 5 children again, and their son, Luke Bernard, is my granddad. Luke Bernard then married a woman called Emma Harris, my beautiful nan, who was a hawker, who we believe came from traveller stock. I have traced her family back to Stafford. My nan was a hawker, my granddad was a dockers labourer, and they had, again, 5 children. 5 children, one of them children is Bridget Bernard. That is my mum. She had 5 children, one of them is me. I have 4 children. One is called Luke, my eldest son, and I have 4 grandchildren. My grandson is named Luke John. To keep in the Irish, my granddaughters are called Siobhan, and my other granddaughter is called Sinead. We were brought up to be very proud of our Irish ancestry as well as our African ancestry. We were brought up Catholic, very strong Catholic. On a Sunday in our home, the first songs were the Irish rebel songs, then African freedom songs, and then our songs, which were Michael Jackson and whoever else. We'd sit and cry to the stories of Kevin Barry, Bobby Sands. Obviously we were older then and understood more what was going on. I feel very proud of my heritage because I feel I've come from 2 great races of people who have been through their country or whatever it was, have been pushed down, put into slavery, starved, but they keep on coming through. I think that's what gives me my pride of my heritage. My granddad, Luke Bernard, a beautiful man, a holy man. He loved all people. He believed all people had the right to live a decent life. He loved my father, and he embraced his grandchildren. We were his first grandchildren, and he embraced us. He taught us to be proud of our Irish ancestry and to be proud of our African ancestry.
So my grandparents are David Cooper and Catherine Cooper, and she was née Maloney. They're my paternal grandparents. My maternal grandparents were James Sheridan and Mary Jane McArdle. Catherine Maloney, she was born in a townland called Masbrook, not far from Castlebar in 1864. She emigrated at some point. She was a teenager when she left Ireland. I think the purpose for her emigrating was to follow her elder sister, Barbara, who had found work in service in Merseyside. But she managed to get work to start with in Glasgow, again in service. So she went to Glasgow, that was her route from Ireland. Whether she liked it or whether it worked out, I don't know. But she didn't stay in Glasgow. She then came down to Liverpool, which is where she settled for the rest of her life. She married my grandfather, David Cooper. David was born in Liverpool and his father was from Liverpool, William Cooper. But sadly, what happened to him was that he as a very young boy, he was orphaned. He was born in 1865, and his father died in 1866. I know there was a typhus and a cholera outbreak in Liverpool at that point, so we don't know. We haven't got it for certain, but it raises the possibility that he lost him due to that, because we also know that they were living in the poorest areas and the poorest immigrant areas in the city where the outbreaks were at their greatest. 3 years later, in 69, so he'd be just 3, he lost his mother as well. And we know there was a scarlet fever outbreak in Liverpool in that year. So we suspect that they were victims of these public health problems, which ran with the circumstances that they were living in. So what happened then was that he was, I think, informally adopted by his aunt and his uncle, whose name was McCoy. Now they'd come over from Ireland, and they were Roseanne McCoy. James McCoy was Roseanne McCoy's brother, and so they took him in as well as his 2 sisters, and they were recorded in an 1871 census as living in Cumberland Street as, in inverted commas, lodgers in a courthouse. Some years later, in the next census, I think David was 6 in 1871. He was 16 at the next census. He was recorded as living in Norman Street, in another courthouse, but this time just with his adoptive mother. So presumably his sisters had moved on. And there's no mention of her husband, so we don't know what happened to him in the intervening period. They married in 1895 in St. Francis Xavier's Church, and I think they were living in the area near St. Francis Xavier's. They went on to, lead their lives in Liverpool. When Catherine first arrived in Liverpool, she obviously her aim was to get work, and in common with a lot of young women of that period, she managed to get work in service, and that was in Croxteth, a hall with the Molyneux, and it's perhaps an indicator of the atmosphere of the time, that she felt very uneasy going to Mass on a Sunday morning. She felt that would have been regarded with suspicion. So, according to family history, she was sort of secreting herself out on Sunday mornings to head to Mass. She was spotted doing this by the Molyneux, but in fairness to them, they asked her why she was going out of the estate and where she was going, and she told them. And in fairness to them, they said, oh, well, you should have time out of work to be able to attend your religious worship. But whether she liked service, I'm not that entirely sure, because her next stab at employment was in the city centre, where she was trying to get work in the city centre shops. And again, she seems to have been not sort of, as a migrant, perhaps this would be the case, not brilliantly aware of the lay of the land in terms of sectarian employment at the time. Because she went for interviews, or it would have been sort of, rough and ready interviews in a number of shops. And of course, in those days, they'd ask what your religion was. So she just said she was a Catholic. And on hearing that, the interview didn't go any further. And then she got to an interview with a shop which survived until, I think, into the 70s in Liverpool city centre, a woman's clothing shop called C&A Modes. Now, they had a history of employing Catholics. I know that because my sister Maureen worked for them, and all the women who worked for them were Catholics, and Maureen knew that was their tradition. Catherine didn't know that, unfortunately, and by that time she thought she'd need to play cute. So when she was asked what religion she had, she said that she was Protestant. So that meant that that was the end of that job prospect. So it just gives a feel of what it was like in terms of sectarianism. And of course, the other feel that you get from their early lives is just the abysmal quality of accommodation and housing that people were living in. It's interesting that David Cooper and his relatives are living in courthouses all around the sort of the edges, the northern edges of the city centre.
Right, my name is Gerry French. I was born Geraldine French in Liverpool, and my father migrated here when he married my mother. He was born in Cullenstown, Duncormac in Wexford in 1916, and he was one of 10 boys. And his father was a farmer, and they had a small farm. And 5 of the boys, as far as I know, joined the British services, because really at that time, in the 1930s, there wasn't a heap of things that you could do apart from be a labourer, maybe on a farm. So the boys came over here and joined the services. So that's my father. The Frenches, after the war, they migrated all over the place. There are Frenches in Australia. There are Frenches in Chicago. One of his brothers went to Toronto and then moved to Portland, Oregon. Another brother moved to San Francisco. So there are Frenches in all those places. So there goes the Frenches. There's a lot of history involved there. But that was all taking place in Ireland, and it's there to read. My mother's family were Liverpool Irish. So my mother's mother was born in Castleblaney in County Monaghan in 1890, and she was one of 7 living children, and her name was Mary Catherine McAdam. And they migrated to this country. The whole family came over in the early 1890s, and they lived in Bootle in various places. And what's been interesting tracing their journey is realizing how the story of migrants repeats itself over and over again in this country. They live umpteen to a room, and I've got all the marriage records of my the family in this country, and my 4 great-grandparents on my mother's side were all illiterate. They all signed their name with a cross on the censuses and on wedding documents. And in 2 generations, we've got, you know, my sisters and I went to university, and yeah, I've got a doctorate in art history. So it's great when you look back at, this is the story of not just Irish migrants, but, you know, it's happening now in the Asian community and the African community. So the McAdams were an interesting bunch. One of my grandmother's brothers, James, his granddaughter, Jennifer McAdam, was Miss United Kingdom and took part in Miss World in I think it was 1970 or something. I remember watching her on the television, and she actually looks like the McAdams. I don't resemble the McAdams at all. They were all black Irish, dark hair and dark eyes, the McAdams. So that was Jenny McAdam. My grandmother's brother, one of her brothers, they all served in the 1914 war, but they went to Australia and joined the Australian forces. I think this might have been some sort of choice that they were. I've never was able to speak to her or them about it. All I know is that the Australian forces were better treated, and so I certainly know Paddy McAdam went out there, joined the forces, became a machine gunner, and survived the war. But Paddy McAdam was also, he began life like the Irish in Liverpool, as you know. If they worked on the docks, or and the Protestants tended to be the carters, didn't they? So Paddy, when he was old enough, went to sea, and he was a fireman, so he was a stoker on the ships. And in 1914, he was on the Carmania, which I didn't know till I found his obituary. And he'd been a stoker on the Carmania. In 1914, the government took these ships from Cunard and other companies and armed them up, you know, including the Lusitania, of course. We know that was armed, although they never admitted it. And the Carmania, it was part of the Battle of Cap Trafalgar, this remarkable battle, where the Carmania went out disguised as the Cap Trafalgar, and the Cap Trafalgar went out to a German ship disguised as the Carmania, and the Cap Trafalgar was sunk. It was the first sea battle of the First World War, and it was a victory for the British. He'd not signed up to fight, and here he was. You can imagine what it must have been like down in the bowels of the ship with the bombs going off upstairs. It must have been terrifying. Yeah. My grandmother, she's the seated woman. That was taken about 1911. And we think she was involved in Sinn Féin activity in all the stuff that was going on prior to the partition in 1920. There was a lot of IRA activity. There was a huge outrage, as the paper called it, in November 1920, when they burnt down all the warehouses. We seem to think, well, we are fairly certain that she was involved in that. Now, my grandmother married my grandfather, and his father was from Wexford. It's the story of the Irish everywhere, isn't it? They marry into the community, and his father was from Wexford. And that was why my mum went to Wexford on holiday and met my father, who was on leave. So that's how I came, my sisters came to have a fully Irish father rather than a Liverpool Irish father. Yeah. So that's it in a nutshell. What may be of interest in terms of the Famine Museum is the situation that my mother's mother left in Ballybay, which I didn't know about. She never went back. Mary McAdam never went back to Ballybay. She never visited again. Whereas we went to Cullenstown in Wexford every single year when I was a child. and it's a huge part of my life. And I'm still in contact with family all over the world. But my grandmother never ever went back to Ballybay. And I went there a few years ago and started doing a bit of research there and discovered that although it was a tiny little town near Castle Blaney, in the 1880s, there was still the aftermath of the famine. You know, the famine didn't end in 1847. There was tremendous hunger there in the late years of the 1870s. And my grandmother lost a child there. And I believe that on the parish, people were living on, they were given a cup of porridge oats. Every person would be given by the church a cup of oats. That was what they were living on, and she was trying to feed a baby. So times were tough there. And also there was a lot of sectarianism there. And I was astonished to find that they had orange marches in a tiny little town like that. So it couldn't have been very welcoming, and they must have thought that the chances would be better in Liverpool. And they came over, landed in Bootle. I don't know if they thought they were in America or something, but that's where they stayed till each of them married on. So they start moving up, don't they? And the children go to school, and then they move out to, you know, to Crosby and places like that. Yeah.
My name is Paddy Reynolds. I'm the son of Paddy Reynolds. I was born in Birkenhead, and so was my father, so was his father. Prior to that, the Reynolds had come from Dundalk. It can be quite a bleak story, this, because people come from Ireland. There was hard times for them, but it wasn't universal. Some of them actually went on to great success, and some of their families have since gone on to great success. My father's mother was Bridget Tocker. The Tockers come from Galway. It's normally very soon after they come to England, it was corrupted to Tucker, because most of my family were illiterate or deemed to be illiterate when they come to Birkenhead. It's where I come from. Bridget Tucker, John Reynolds is my great grandfather married Ellen Wilson, who married Francis Traynor. The Traynors and the Wilsons come from Armagh. It was Margaret Traynor, sorry. Margaret Traynor died in Birkenhead from typhus, and she lived in St Anne Street. It's one of those it's a very bleak time, but at the same time in Price Street, there was born the person who became the editor of The Observer, James Lewis Garvin. And it's that kind of contrast, from the same kind of mean streets these people could come. Francis Traynor, he died in Birkenhead warehouse along with 4 of his children. So that's the bleak side of it. The Tockers, again, they all stayed in Birkenhead, in the middle of Birkenhead, in an area there's a plaque up at the top of Price Street. They all lived in that area. They were all very Catholic. The church played a prominent part in their lives. There is a reference in the books I've got from a thesis that was unpublished by a fellow who did an awful lot of work on it. And some of these streets were 90% Catholic. By the same token, the occupations were invariably dockers, or they went to sea as firemen, stokers. On my mum's side, the Shaws, they come from Kildare. The first one of them to appear in the census in Birkenhead is in 1861 in Oak Street. Oak Street's played a part in my family's history since that time. My mum and dad were both born in Oak Street, as was my dad's father. Oak Street has actually been prominent in my life, but it was also prominent in the history of Birkenhead. During the Garibaldi riots of 1862, an inhabitant of Oak Street, Henry Lennon, was actually charged. Henry Lennon, incidentally, was a Catholic, charged with assaulting an Irish policeman, Patrick Carney, who was also a Catholic. And funnily enough, at one stage, Patrick Carney also lived in Oak Street. Henry Lennon was deported to Australia. And from my research, he was innocent, he was just a stooge. But it's interesting that the Catholic Church played a prominent part in defending the rioters. Patrick Carney's two daughters, one of these coincidences, Patrick Carney's two daughters actually taught my mother. And one of his sons become a Catholic priest. So it's that kind of, you know, which side are you on here? That was the Shaws. My mum's mother was a Burns, and they come from Carlow. And that's the one I referred to earlier on, Bridget Burns. She was always in trouble. She got tried twice for manslaughter in Bergen and never convicted. She finished up in the Emigrant hospital in Bentley outside Bristol. Now it's interesting, again the contrast. Bridget Burns' cousin, David Kenny, was one of the founder members of the National Union of Seamen. He was one of the first Labour councillors in Birkenhead. He died during the 1911 strike in Liverpool, they reckon because of the hard work. But he was an associate of Havelock Wilson, Tom Mann, etc., etc. And I often know David Kenny, not only was he kind of prominent in the trade union movement, he was actually a very prominent Catholic. He was in the choir of St. Lawrence's, and I have visions of him walking down Watson Street, which is a thoroughfare of Birkenhead, on a Sunday morning after going to church, thinking, there's our Bridget drunk again. But going back to Oak Street had a terrible reputation. The church just adjacent to it was St. Lawrence's, a Catholic church, and they used to say Hail Marys on the hour for the inhabitants of Oak Street. And over time, they reckon they repented. I don't much believe this, but they repented, and they actually got a kind of a better reputation. The funny thing about Oak Street, there's documents like, there's prominently Irish, like 90%, 99% Irish, but there was factions, two Irish factions. Now, Oak Street's only about 100 yards long, but there was two factions in it, and you know, you're in court, you're in newspapers. I've got the name of the mayor, what they call it, the Leinster mob, I think, and the Connaught mob, or the Dundalk mob. But there was that kind of factionalism, so it wasn't a kind of these unified people, we're all in the same boat. The commonality was you were all Irish, but you come from different counties. And I remember reading, like you say in court documents, like a woman's in court for calling someone a Dundalk-looking bee. Oh, you Connaught-looking bee. But it is that kind of, a lot of references to different counties.
Hi, my name's Paul Barry. I'm a local GP on Merseyside. As you can tell by my surname, Barry is obviously of Irish origin. I've always been aware that the Barry family were originally from Limerick, and in fact John Barry, who is my dad's grandfather, the story from the family was that he walked from Limerick to Dublin and came to Liverpool looking for work on his own. At that point, the family connection seemed limited beyond that, and there was very little apparent interest in my family about our Irish heritage. Over recent years, I've been looking at our own genealogy, and actually I uncovered far more than I expected. It started when I started looking at my great uncle Jimmy O'Donnell, as my interest in the First World War, and I realised that Jimmy actually. It's a whole story about Jimmy, but then I realised that Jimmy O'Donnell was probably of Irish extraction, and his mum, who is his sister, is my dad's mum, is obviously Mary O'Donnell. I then looked into the O'Donnell family and realised that they were actually from Newport, Mayo. Hugh O'Donnell came over in the 1850s. It's difficult to know beyond that why Hugh came, but I assume, like John Barry, it was as an economic migrant. When looking at Jimmy, I then looked at his other grandparent, who is a lady called Jane Henry. And Jane Henry, and they all lived in Circus Street, which is Little Italy area of Liverpool, where obviously it's a big mix of Irish and Italian immigrants. But the Henry family, I then realised, are actually from Cavan. And Francis Henry again came over sometime in the 1850s. Again, it's difficult to know why he came. He was a simple labourer, as were the Barrys actually. In fact, every single member of my family seems to have had the title labourer or bus conductor, which is typical of what I would expect from the Liverpool Irish, really. So the Henrys, anyway, to go back to them, they're from Cavan. And Francis Henry married Sarah McCoyd, in Cavan. But I have little information beyond that. In fact, at the moment, most of my restrictions are based on the Irish side to determine what year they came and more history about them. I then started looking a bit more at John Barry again. So John Barry, this is the guy who came from Limerick. He actually, his father was John Barry and his mother was Elizabeth Shigrew. And we have the baptismal papers from Limerick for that. John Barry, when he came to Liverpool, appeared to live in a boarding house for a while with a lot of other Irish immigrants, and he married a lady called Anne Garrity. And Anne Garrity's dad was a guy called Patrick Garrity, and when I looked into Patrick Garrity is also from Mayo, or possibly the Mayo-Galway border, but I'm struggling to find information about that family beyond that. I then went over to my mother's side, and she's the daughter of a Kerr family. Now, the Kerrs are interesting in that they are actually Protestants, and I'm aware that her father, Johnny Kerr, who was also in the Second World War, actually was a member of the Orange Lodge. His wife was Emma Doherty. Emma Doherty comes from a very strong Catholic family, and I'm aware that there was a great break-up in the family at that point, which is why my mum knows so little about that family tree, because actually neither Emma or John ever had contact with their own families properly ever again, because a Catholic married a Protestant. Now, to us in this society now, that seems really strange. But Emma, anyway, was from the Taylor family, but I have very little information on the Taylor family. But Emma actually is a Doherty, and her father was Michael Doherty. And Michael Doherty definitely came over in the 1840s, which would fit with the famine, and he again is from Mayo. On John Kerr's side, the Kerrs actually married a family called the Ormsbys. So his mum was Elizabeth Ann Ormsby. Now Ormsby, when I look into the Ormsby family, it's a Lincolnshire name. But actually in the 16th or 17th, actually it was the 16th century, around the Elizabethan era, the Ormsbys went to Mayo and were given a lot of land. And her family is her father, Elizabeth Ann Ormsby, her father was William Ormsby. And again, they're from Mayo, probably from Westport. And it's difficult to know when they came over. Well, when I look at when their siblings were born, it looks to me that's about between 1845 to 1849. So they left Mayo at that time. I'm trying to work out more information about the Ormsbys because I suspect they probably they were more well off than the other members of my family, because the Ormsbys had a lot of land in Mayo, but it's difficult to know what the relationship was. And I will actually go to Mayo at some point and try and work out a bit more about those. But I think they were Protestants, which would fit. But go back to the O'Donnells, they're from Newport in Mayo, and Hugh O'Donnell married a lady called Bridget Highland. Again, that's a Mayo name. And also we also have another strand called the Scots. Now, Scott obviously is a name that was given to anybody who could speak Gaelic, I assume. But I suspect they're again from Mayo. When I submitted my DNA through the ancestry site, and I realised that that's actually that's predicated basically on who actually submits their DNA. So there's an assumption that that your heritage is exact from that, but it probably isn't. But it's quite clear that my family predominantly come from Mayo. Well, my genetic connections are Mayo, not Limerick, as we were all surprised by, because the Barrys are obviously from Limerick, and Shigrew is a Kerry name. We have some connection with Northern Ireland, or the North, through the McCoys, I suspect, and the Henrys. And then we have a connection into Scotland, which again, I suspect that may be a Presbyterian link, where the Scots migrated over.